Now that we have come to terms with looking at the framework and learning the language, again, looking at what apparent uncaused fleeing looks like, apparent uncaused fear, a sense of guilt, a lack of love, and just understanding those dynamics, we now want to try to pull those things to practice in doing a case. And in doing the case, our goal is to help you to understand how to counsel through the case, but also prepare you because as part of your final exam, you're going to have to do a case on your final exam. And so I want to kind of walk you through the process of how to think it through so that you can do this because you're going to see, again, this exact same thing on a case that will be on your final. So let me just kind of read some things out loud, and then from there we'll try to apply this together, you and I. It says, review this case and identify and write down these things: expressions of uncaused fleeing, if there are any; expressions of uncaused fear, if there are any; expressions of a sense of guilt, if there are any; and secondary unloving attitudes, words, or actions. Now, let me explain that for a moment. When you're doing a case, you're doing what you do in Bible study methods. You're doing observation, interpretation, and then application. Your observation is that you're looking for, do I see any expressions of apparently uncaused fleeing? Do I see any expressions of apparently uncaused fear? Do I see any expressions of a sense of guilt? And let me just explain what a secondary unloving attitude is. Secondary means this: the thing is a sin that the person is committing, but the sin is being used as a way of apparently uncaused fleeing from the main sin. So a secondary sin is something like drinking alcohol, getting drunk to not deal with your guilty conscience, watching pornography to escape from another issue you don't want to deal with, or getting high, or stealing, or setting things on fire. Those are things that can be used as a way to escape from not dealing with the main thing. And a lot of people, you'll discover, is that the secondary sin they make primary. And in biblical counseling, a secondary unloving attitude is just another way of fleeing, apparently uncaused fleeing, if you will, from not dealing with the guilty conscience because of the primary lack of love issue. So when you hear secondary, you're thinking this is a sin, but this is not the main problem. This is being used to escape apparent uncaused fleeing from the main thing. So let's look at a case together, and we're going to see if we can identify these things. Now remember, when you're looking at a case, you're trying to discover if those things exist in the case, meaning are they being identified that you can observe them. You're not trying to force those things in the case. Now, let's read about Emmett. It says, Emmett is a 40-year-old married man who's married to Betty, who's 39. She has a daughter that is 19 years old from a previous marriage. She comes to visit from time to time, that is the daughter. The daughter lives with her biological father. Emmett has been having a hard time relating properly with his wife. Over the last couple of days, things have become very tense between them. Emmett withdraws and goes to read a book or work on other things. He changes the subject when asked certain questions. He is constantly fighting with her and complains of her lack of respect for him and his decisions. He frequently leaves the house and returns very late. He even has a drink or two before he comes home. Emmett complains that when her 19-year-old daughter visits, the wife tends to disrespect him and favor her. Whenever the daughter is around, there is confusion and disorder. His wife blames him for their daughter not staying with them, and he challenges his wife. The behavior has been this way and keeps happening since the daughter has asked to come to live with them. Now, given that, we're going to go back over that together, but using the biblical framework, we need to see if we can find some things. First of all, is there any expression of uncaused fleeing that we see in this case? Is there any expression of uncaused fear that we can see? Is there any expression of a sense of guilt that we can see? Are there any secondary unloving attitudes that we can see? And so let's take a look back at this and let's read through it to see what we can find. First of all, let's see if we can find any apparently uncaused fleeing. Again, we see that Emmett is 40 years old. He has a daughter that's 19. His wife has a daughter that's 19. And it says, Emmett has had a hard time properly relating with his wife over the last couple of days. Things have been very tense between them. It says, Emmett withdraws and goes to read a book or work on other things. That is a demonstration of apparently uncaused fleeing. It says he changes the subject when asked certain questions. That is an expression of apparently uncaused fleeing. Now notice he is constantly fighting with his wife or complains of a lack of respect for him and his decisions. That is sin, to be complaining and fighting, but it is not the main problem that he has. So that is a secondary unloving attitude. It is being used to flee from his primary issue with his wife. So we would look at that as secondary unloving attitude and also an expression of apparent uncaused fleeing. It says he frequently leaves the house and returns very late. Well, that is apparent uncaused fleeing. He even has a drink or two before he comes home. Well, obviously trying to escape from what's happening. That's apparent uncaused fleeing. Emmett complains that when her 19-year-old daughter visits his wife, she tends to disrespect him and favor her. We saw that already constantly in the fighting part. Again, it says there's confusion and disorder. His wife blames him for their daughter not staying with them, and he challenges her. She's walking in the AU fleeing by her attitudes there, but we want to primarily focus on Emmett at this point. It says this behavior has begun to happen since the daughter has asked to come to live with them. So as we reread it, we see all these expressions so far are just merely exposing apparently uncaused fleeing. Well, it says, do we see any expressions of apparent uncaused fear? As we look at this case, there are no expressions of uncaused fear being demonstrated, even though we know uncaused fear may be happening in the heart, because you can't have AU fleeing without the uncaused fear, but there's none being demonstrated in this particular case. Do we see any sense of guilt being demonstrated? Well, there is a sense of guilt there, but we can't see it being demonstrated in the case. So remember, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but there's none that we can identify that's being demonstrated. What that means for you and I is this. Sometimes there may be things that are going on in the heart of man that are not being revealed in the actions of man. And so far from this case, we're noticing that yes, there's a sense of guilt and AU fear in the heart. It's just not being demonstrated, but what is being demonstrated is apparently uncaused fleeing. So in seeing that, here's what we know from this case so far in our analyzing of it. AU fleeing is there, which means the sense of guilt and AU fear has to be there, because you can't have apparently uncaused fleeing without having apparently uncaused fear. You can't have apparently uncaused fear without having a sense of guilt. But since only AU fleeing is being demonstrated, that's what we will identify and write down at the time. Now, given that, it says, identify the lack of love issue or issues that are causing the apparently uncaused fear, the apparently uncaused fleeing, and the sense of guilt. Well, if we think about it, in the context, there's a time frame. It says that the behavior has been happening. In other words, this thing that we see between Emmett and his wife started to happen when the daughter said that she wanted to come back and live with them. Now, most people will say, well, I think that the lack of love is that Emmett is angry with his stepdaughter. And that would be totally wrong, because the problem is not with his stepdaughter. If you notice, the problem is with his wife. So if we were to really try to figure out what the lack of love is, notice the time frame when she asked to come, and when she's over, notice in the case, he doesn't have a problem with his daughter or stepdaughter, if you will. It seems to rise up between him and his wife. So as we do our proper observation and start doing interpretation, we can discover that Emmett is angry with his wife, which is the lack of love, and he is jealous of his stepdaughter. You go, well, how did you come there? Well, notice the time frame. These actions of him fleeing and these fights and things constantly happen when she's there, and he believes that she's getting, again, if you will, more of Emmett's or she's getting his attention and affection is going towards the daughter, and he feels like he tends to be disrespected by his wife. We don't know if that's true or not, but what we do know is this attitude arises when she's around. And because it's really with his wife, we can see the connection that there's jealousy with the daughter and there is anger towards the wife. Well, if we put that on the framework, we would say, well, what is the lack of love issue? We could say that the attitudinal motivational lack of love is anger and jealousy. So if that's what it is, again, is it a communication lack of love issue? We could say not necessarily, because the fighting and fussing, that's the way of fleeing. And remember, the fruit issues cannot be the root issues. The fruit issues are just those things that manifest themselves because of the root. And what we're discovering is the root lack of love issue that's causing all of what we see is jealousy towards the daughter and anger towards the wife. So as we put that together, the next thing we would do is then we would identify what does he need to do to move from a lack of love in this to love. Well, the first thing is he would need to confess his jealousy towards his daughter, or stepdaughter, and he'd need to confess his anger to God, both of those. He would need to then count on being forgiven of this jealousy and anger. And he would need to begin to understand that he would need to walk by the Holy Spirit in his attitude in those areas. Because again, jealousy and anger are attitudes of the heart that he needs to deal with. And as he do this, he can expect God to forgive him of this particular attitude of jealousy and anger. Well, now that's moving from the confessing and counting on forgiveness and being controlled and counting on control. How do we now move him into love? Now that he's confessed and counted on forgiveness, in order to walk in love towards God, the first thing is that he needs to embrace the character of God, that God is sufficient and God is sovereign, so that he would not be jealous and that he would not be angry. He would also need to accept that God has allowed him to have a stepdaughter that he needs to learn how to love on in the proper manner. And he needs to be thankful that God has given him everything he needs was in the moment. And he needs to also to begin, if you will, to think on good things and not think in a negative way towards his wife, but begin to think in a way that's loving towards her and to begin to think in a way that is loving towards his daughter. But the primary thing is to embrace that God is sufficient, to embrace the sovereignty of God. He is enough. He's in control. To accept what God has allowed and to be thankful that he has a family that he can begin to lead in love. Well, what does he need to do in love towards his daughter-in-law or his stepdaughter and towards his wife? He needs to ask their forgiveness for the way he's been carrying himself towards them. And needs to identify ways that he could serve his wife in a loving way and identify ways that he can begin to support his daughter to come. And again, what we've just done is to just give some practical things. And as you're doing a case, you're going to do some of this to help you walk through as you're working through a case. And so I hope this helps you to get a picture of this. And as you struggle with the process or you're saying, I'm really not getting it, please don't hesitate to email or to call so that we can help you work through the details. But keep working with it. Keep walking it through and take your time. God bless you.